The morning frost painted delicate patterns on the windows of the old cabin as Sophie rolled out of bed, careful not to wake her little sister, who was still curled up under 3 layers of blankets. At 17, Sophie had learned to wake before the alarm, a necessary skill when you're trying to be both sister and parent. She shivered as her feet hit the cold wooden floor, quickly slipping into the worn slippers beside her bed. The cabin creaked as she moved through the narrow hallway toward the kitchen. It was barely 6, and darkness still clung to the mountains surrounding their small town of Pine Ridge. Sophie stoked the dying embers in the wood stove, adding kindling and 2 logs from the dwindling pile near the door. They'd need more wood soon, another task for her growing list. "Morning, sunshine," her grandmother called softly from her rocking chair. Rose hadn't been sleeping well lately, her arthritis worse with the bitter cold snap that had held the town in its grip for nearly 2 weeks. "Grandma, you should be resting," Sophie said, pouring water into the kettle. "Did your hands keep you up again?" Rose's fingers, once nimble enough to create the most beautiful quilts in the county, now bent at painful angles. "Nothing worse than usual," she said with a smile that couldn't quite hide her discomfort. "Besides, watching the sunrise is worth a little lost sleep." Sophie placed the kettle on the stove and glanced at the calendar hanging crookedly on the wall. She'd circled today's date in red, payday at both the diner and the general store. Not that the combined checks would amount to much, but enough to cover groceries and maybe put a little aside for Maya's new boots. Her sister had outgrown hers and winter was only getting started. 3 years. That's how long they'd been living like this, scraping by, taking each day as it came. 3 years since the Northern Resources Corporation had shut down the lumber mill where their father had worked for 15 years. 3 years since he'd looked so defeated coming home that last day, his lunch pail swinging empty at his side. 8 months later, he was gone, a heart attack, the doctor had said. Though Sophie knew it was really a heart broken by helplessness. Their mother hadn't lasted the year, pneumonia taking her the following winter when heating the house became a luxury they couldn't quite afford. "You're thinking too hard for this early," Rose said, interrupting Sophie's thoughts. "Your face gets all scrunched up just like your daddy's used to." Sophie forced a smile. "Just planning the day," she lied. "Double shift at the diner, then 2 hours at the store. Miss Chen said I could help with inventory. That woman works you too hard. We need the money." "Grandma." The floorboards creaked and Sophie turned to find Maya standing in the doorway, her dark hair a tangled mess, eyes still heavy with sleep. At 12, she was all knees and elbows, growing too fast for their budget to keep up. "Did I hear something about payday?" Maya asked, stifling a yawn. Sophie nodded. "And if you hurry and get ready for school without your usual complaints, we might stop by Wilson's on the way home for hot chocolate." Maya's face lit up. It was their small tradition, one affordable luxury on payday Fridays. "With whipped cream? Is there any other way?" Sophie winked, and for a moment everything felt almost normal. As Maya hurried to wash up, Rose caught Sophie's hand. "You're doing too much, child. You should be thinking about college, not working yourself to the bone." Sophie had gotten good at dodging this conversation. She'd been top of her class before everything fell apart, with dreams of studying engineering. Now those college brochures gathered dust under her bed, fantasy fuel for nights when sleep wouldn't come. "We've got time to figure that out," Sophie said, the same answer she always gave. "Right now we need to get Maya off to school." The morning routine unfolded with practiced efficiency. Sophie packed Maya's lunch, a peanut butter sandwich, an apple from the clearance bin at the store, and the last granola bar from the pantry. She made a mental note to hit the food bank before her shift tomorrow. "Don't forget your science homework," Sophie reminded her sister as they bundled up against the cold. "And button your coat all the way up." "You sound like Mom," Maya said, then immediately regretted it, her eyes widening. They rarely mentioned their parents directly, the loss still too raw even after 3 years. Sophie swallowed hard. "Well, someone's got to make sure your ears don't freeze off," she said lightly, tugging a knit hat over Maya's head. The walk to the bus stop took them through what had once been the heart of Pine Ridge. They passed the shuttered mill, its massive doors chained, windows broken by summer storms and never repaired. Rust had begun to claim the machinery visible through the fence. Nearly 300 people had lost their jobs when Northern Resources pulled out, claiming market downturns and the need for corporate restructuring. Half the town had left within a year, seeking work in bigger cities. Those who stayed, like Rose and her granddaughters, clung to Pine Ridge with stubborn determination. This mountain town was home even if home had seen better days. "Hey, Sophie," called a voice from the hardware store. Mr. Dawkins waved from where he was shoveling the sidewalk. "Tell your grandmother I've got those washers she needed for the sink." "Will do, Mr. D," Sophie called back with a wave. This was the upside of small-town life. Everyone knew everyone. The downside was that everyone also knew their struggles, had witnessed their families' slow unraveling. Sophie felt their pitying glances like physical things, though most tried to hide it. At the bus stop, 3 other kids huddled against the wind. Maya joined them, immediately falling into conversation with her friend Zach, whose father had also worked at the mill. Sophie watched until the yellow school bus appeared around the corner, waited until Maya climbed aboard with a backward wave, and then turned toward the diner where her morning shift would begin in 20 minutes. Main Street was quiet, most businesses opening later. Sophie passed the bank, the post office, the small medical clinic that was only open 3 days a week now. At the end of the street stood Town Hall, where the mayor had once proudly announced the mill's expansion. That same mayor had left town shortly after the closure, another broken promise in a long line of disappointments. The diner windows glowed warm against the gray morning. Inside, Fran was already preparing the grill, the smell of bacon and coffee mixing in the air. Sophie hung her coat on the rack by the door and tied an apron around her waist. "Morning, sweetie," Fran said, sliding a mug of coffee across the counter. "You look tired." "Just the usual," Sophie replied, taking a grateful sip. Fran always gave her the first cup free, though they both pretended it was left over from yesterday's pot. "Well, perk up. The breakfast crowd will be in soon, and tips are better when you smile." Sophie nodded, checking the syrup dispensers and filling salt and pepper shakers. The work was mindless but necessary, like most things in her life these days. She'd gotten good at living in the moment, focusing on the task at hand rather than dwelling on what might have been or worrying about what was to come. By 7, the regulars began arriving, mostly retirees and the few workers from businesses that had survived the mill's closure. Sophie moved between tables with practiced ease, remembering who wanted extra butter, who needed their coffee black, who would chat and who preferred silence with their morning paper. As she refilled the coffee of Mr. Jenkins, the retired high school principal, he asked, "How's school going, Sophie? Still keeping those grades up?" "Yes, sir," she answered. In truth, her straight A record had slipped to mostly B's with the occasional C, but she was still passing everything despite missing more classes than she should. Most teachers looked the other way, understanding her situation. Good. Don't let circumstances derail your future," he said, echoing advice he'd given her many times before. "College scholarships are out there for bright minds." Sophie nodded politely but said nothing. College seemed as distant as the moon these days. Her future extended only as far as next week's schedule, next month's bills. Dreams had become an unaffordable luxury. During her break, Sophie called home from the diner's phone to check on Rose. Her grandmother assured her that she was fine, just working on mending Maya's winter coat where the sleeve had torn. "The Hendersons dropped off some venison stew," Rose added. "Enough for dinner tonight." Another act of community kindness they couldn't refuse. Pride took a backseat to practicality when feeding a family was the priority. Sophie made a mental note to bake Mrs. Henderson some of those oatmeal cookies she liked, a small repayment that wouldn't strain their budget. As her shift continued, Sophie caught herself watching the clock, calculating the hours until she could pick up Maya, the days until their small bank account would need replenishing again. This was her life now, a constant mathematics of survival. Yet when Mr. Thompson left his usual generous tip with a wink, when Fran slipped an extra muffin into Sophie's bag for "that sweet sister of yours," when Mrs. Lawrence asked if Sophie could babysit next weekend because the twins just adore you, Sophie felt the invisible threads that connected them all, the unspoken support system that had developed in the wake of collective hardship. Pine Ridge might be struggling, but its heart still beat strongly in its people. As Sophie wiped down tables before the lunch rush, she gazed out at the mountains surrounding their valley, their peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds, heavy with the promise of snow. A storm was coming. The weather report had warned of a big one. Sophie added another item to her mental list. Check the emergency supplies. Make sure the lanterns had fuel. In these mountains, preparation wasn't just prudent, it was essential. What she couldn't prepare for, what none of them could possibly anticipate, was how this approaching storm would bring a stranger to their door, a man whose decisions had shaped their lives from afar, a man who would change everything once again. The storm arrived faster than anyone expected. What the weather report had described as significant snowfall turned into the worst blizzard Pine Ridge had seen in 20 years. It started on Saturday morning with gentle flakes that quickly transformed into a relentless white curtain, driven by winds that howled down from the mountain peaks like hungry wolves. By noon, Mayor Wilson had declared a state of emergency. The town's single snowplow couldn't keep up with the rapidly accumulating snow, and the road leading out to the highway was already impassable. School's canceled for Monday, Sophie told Maya as they peered out the frosted kitchen window. The phone lines were still working, though the electricity had been flickering ominously for the past hour. Usually I'd be happy about that, Maya said, her breath fogging the glass. But this is kind of scary. Sophie put her arm around her sister's shoulders. We've weathered storms before. Remember what Dad always said? Mountain folk bend with the wind but never break, Maya recited, a small smile playing at her lips. Their father had been full of such sayings, little nuggets of country wisdom that seemed more precious now that he was gone. Sophie often found herself repeating them, both for Maya's benefit and her own. Rose shuffled into the kitchen, clutching her sweater tight around her thin frame. The radio says we could lose power for days. The electric company's already reporting outages all over the county. As if on cue, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. The sudden silence as the refrigerator stopped humming was almost as startling as the darkness. Right on schedule, Sophie said dryly. She moved confidently through the familiar space, finding the drawer where they kept candles and matches. Within minutes, a warm glow filled the kitchen. We should check our supplies, Rose suggested, easing herself into a chair at the kitchen table. Her arthritis always worsened in cold weather, and today her movements were particularly stiff. Sophie was already mentally cataloging what they had on hand. Food's not a problem. We've got enough canned goods to last a week. Water too, since the well pump has the backup generator. But she glanced toward the window, where the snow continued to fall in thick sheets. The woodpile's getting low. We used more than usual this week with the cold snap, Rose agreed. Maya looked between them. We need to get more wood before it gets completely buried in snow, don't we? Sophie nodded. Dad stacked a bunch behind the shed last winter. We just need to bring some up to the porch. I'll help, Maya volunteered, already reaching for her coat. Are you sure that's wise? Rose asked, concern etching deeper lines around her eyes. The storm's only getting worse. Sophie checked her watch. It was just past 1 in the afternoon, though the sky outside was so dark it could have been dusk. We'll be quick, Grandma. Just a few trips to get enough for the next couple of days. The shed's only 50 yards from the back door. Rose didn't look convinced, but she knew as well as Sophie did that they needed that firewood. Take the rope, she insisted. Tie yourselves together. People get lost in blizzards just going from their house to their barn. We will, Sophie promised, helping Maya button her coat all the way up before putting on her own. They layered scarves, hats, and the thickest gloves they owned. Sophie found the coil of rope in the mudroom and tied it securely around both their waists, leaving about 6 feet of slack between them. Back in 20 minutes, Sophie assured her grandmother, giving her a quick kiss on the cheek. Keep those candles away from the curtains. The moment they stepped onto the back porch, the wind nearly knocked them over. The cold bit through their layers instantly, and snow pelted their faces like tiny needles. Stay close, Sophie shouted over the wind, keeping a firm grip on Maya's arm as they pushed forward. The familiar path to the shed had vanished under nearly 2 feet of snow, forcing them to high-step through the drifts. The shed appeared as a dark shape through the swirling white. Sophie fumbled with the latch, her fingers clumsy in their thick gloves, and finally pulled the door open. They stumbled inside, grateful for the momentary shelter from the wind. I can barely feel my nose, Maya complained, rubbing her face. At least it's still there, Sophie teased, moving toward the back of the shed where their father's tools hung in neat rows on the wall. She grabbed the small wooden sled they used for hauling firewood and passed Maya a pair of work gloves to put over her regular ones. These will give you a better grip. Behind the shed, partially covered by a tarp, was the woodpile, logs split, and stacked by their father during his last healthy summer. Sophie felt the familiar pang whenever she accessed this diminishing resource, as if each log burned was another piece of him gone forever. They worked quickly, loading the sled with as many logs as it could hold. The wind had changed direction, now blowing snow under the tarp and coating the remaining wood. "One more trip after this should do it," Sophie said as they finished securing the load. "Ready?" Maya nodded, her face barely visible between her hat and scarf. They began the return journey, Sophie pulling the sled while Maya pushed from behind. The snow was falling so heavily now that their outbound footprints had already disappeared. They made it to the house, unloaded the wood onto the covered porch, and headed back out despite Rose's protests that they should wait for the storm to ease. Sophie knew better. The forecast suggested this would continue well into tomorrow. On their second trip, as they rounded the corner of the shed, Maya suddenly stopped. "Did you hear that?" she asked, voice muffled by her scarf. Sophie paused, listening. At first she heard nothing but the howling wind. Then, a faint metallic creaking followed by what sounded like breaking glass. "It's coming from down there," Maya pointed toward the old service road that ran behind their property. It wasn't, much more than a dirt track that loggers had used years ago to access the back acres. "Probably just a tree branch fallen on something," Sophie said, but she felt uneasy. That hadn't sounded like a tree branch. "We should check," Maya insisted. "What if someone's out there?" Sophie hesitated. The smart thing would be to get the firewood and go back inside. "But if someone was out there in this weather?" "5 minutes," she conceded. "But we stay together, understand?" They left the sled and followed the sound, the rope between them now a vital lifeline, as visibility dropped to mere feet. The service road dipped down a small hill, and as they carefully made their way down the slope, the wind momentarily died down enough for them to see it, a large black shape half buried in the snow. "It's a car," Maya gasped. Not just any car, Sophie realized as they got closer. It was a massive luxury SUV, the kind no one in Pine Ridge could afford. It had clearly slid off the main road above, rolling down the embankment before coming to rest against a cluster of pine trees. One of the windows was shattered and snow was accumulating on the leather seats inside. "Hello?" Sophie called out, approaching cautiously. "Is anyone there? Do you need help?" No response came from inside the vehicle. The driver might have walked. "To find help," Sophie suggested. But even as she said it, she knew how unlikely that was. No one would abandon a vehicle like this unless they had no choice, and walking in this blizzard would be suicide for someone unfamiliar with the area. Maya had moved to the driver's side, standing on tiptoes to peer in through the window. Suddenly, she screamed, "Sophie, there's someone inside!" Sophie rushed around, her heart pounding. Through the snow-dusted window, she could make out a figure slumped across the front seats. A man in a dark coat, his head resting at an awkward angle against the passenger door. She tried the driver's door. Locked. She knocked hard on the window, but the man didn't stir. "We need to get in there," Sophie decided, looking around frantically. She spotted a large rock half buried in snow and dragged it free. "Stand back, Maya." With one solid hit, she shattered the driver's side window, quickly reaching in to unlock the door. Cold air rushed into the vehicle as she pulled the door open, but the man didn't react. As her shift continued, Sophie caught herself watching the clock, calculating the hours until she could pick up Maya, the days until their small bank account would need replenishing again. This was her life now, a constant mathematics of survival. Yet when Mr. Thompson left his usual generous tip with a wink, when Fran slipped an extra muffin into Sophie's bag, "For that sweet sister of yours," when Mrs. Lawrence asked if Sophie could babysit next weekend because the twins just adore you, Sophie felt the invisible threads that connected them all, the unspoken support system that had developed in the wake of collective hardship. Pine Ridge might be struggling, but its heart still beat strongly in its people. As Sophie wiped down tables before the lunch rush, she gazed out at the mountains surrounding their valley, their peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds heavy with the promise of snow. A storm was coming. The weather report had warned of a big one. Sophie added another item to her mental list. Check the emergency supplies, make sure the lanterns had fuel. In these mountains, preparation wasn't just prudent, it was essential. What she couldn't prepare for, what none of them could possibly anticipate, was how this approaching storm would bring a stranger to their door. A man whose decisions had shaped their lives from afar, a man who would change everything once again. The storm arrived faster than anyone expected. What the weather report had described as significant snowfall turned into the worst blizzard Pine Ridge had seen in 20 years. It started on Saturday morning with gentle flakes that quickly transformed into a relentless white curtain, driven by winds that howled down from the mountain peaks like hungry wolves. By noon, Mayor Wilson had declared a state of emergency. The town's single snowplow couldn't keep up with the rapidly accumulating snow, and the road leading out to the highway was already impassable. School's canceled for Monday, Sophie told Maya as they peered out the frosted kitchen window. The phone lines were still working, though the electricity had been flickering ominously for the past hour. Usually I'd be happy about that, Maya said, her breath fogging the glass above. But this is kind of scary. Sophie put her arm around her sister's shoulders. We've weathered storms before. Remember what Dad always said? Mountain folk bend with the wind but never break, Maya recited, a small smile playing at her lips. Their father had been full of such sayings, little nuggets of country wisdom that seemed more precious now that he was gone. Sophie often found herself repeating them, both for Maya's benefit and her own. Rose shuffled into the kitchen, clutching her sweater tight around her thin frame. The radio says we could lose power for days. The electric company's already reporting outages all over the county. As if on cue, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. The sudden silence as the refrigerator stopped humming was almost as startling as the darkness. Right on schedule, Sophie said dryly. She moved confidently through the familiar space, finding the drawer where they kept candles and matches. Within minutes, a warm glow filled the kitchen. We should check our supplies, Rose suggested, easing herself into a chair at the kitchen table. Her arthritis always worsened in cold weather, and today her movements were particularly stiff. Sophie was already mentally cataloging what they had on hand. Food's not a problem. We've got enough canned goods to last a week. Water, too, since the well pump has the backup generator. But she glanced toward the window where the snow continued to fall in thick sheets. The woodpile's getting low. We used more than usual this week with the cold snap, Rose agreed. Maya looked between them. We need to get more wood before it gets completely buried in snow, don't we? Sophie nodded. Dad stacked a bunch behind the shed last winter. We just need to bring some up to the porch. I'll help, Maya volunteered, already reaching for her coat. Are you sure that's wise? Rose asked, concern etching deeper lines around her eyes. The storm's only getting worse. Sophie checked her watch. It was just past 1 in the afternoon, though the sky outside was so dark it could have been dusk. We'll be quick, Grandma. Just a few trips to get enough for the next couple of days. The shed's only 50 yards from the back door. Rose didn't look convinced, but she knew as well as Sophie did that they needed that firewood. Take the rope, she insisted. Tie yourselves together. People get lost in blizzards just going from their house to their barn. We will, Sophie promised, helping Maya button her coat all the way up before putting on her own. They layered scarves, hats, and the thickest gloves they owned. Sophie found the coil of rope in the mudroom and tied it securely around both their waists, leaving about 6 feet of slack between them. Back in 20 minutes, Sophie assured her grandmother, giving her a quick kiss on the cheek. Keep those candles away from the curtains. The moment they stepped onto the back porch, the wind nearly knocked them over. The cold bit through their layers instantly, and snow pelted their faces like tiny needles. Stay close, Sophie shouted over the wind, keeping a firm grip on Maya's arm as they pushed forward. The familiar path to the shed had vanished under nearly 2 feet of snow, forcing them to high-step through the drifts. The shed appeared as a dark shape through the swirling white. Sophie fumbled with the latch, her fingers clumsy in their thick gloves, and finally pulled the door open. They stumbled inside, grateful for the momentary shelter from the wind. I can barely feel my nose, Maya complained, rubbing her face. At least it's still there, Sophie teased, moving toward the back of the shed where their father's tools hung in neat rows on the wall. She grabbed the small wooden sled they used for hauling firewood and passed Maya a pair of work gloves to put over her regular ones. These will give you a better grip. Behind the shed, partially covered by a tarp, was the woodpile, logs split and stacked by their father during his last healthy summer. Sophie felt the familiar pang whenever she accessed this diminishing resource, as if each log burned was another piece of him gone forever. They worked quickly, loading the sled with as many logs as it could hold. The wind had changed direction, now blowing snow under the tarp and coating the remaining wood. "One more trip after this should do it," Sophie said, as they finished securing the load. "Ready?" Maya nodded, her face barely visible between her hat and scarf. They began the return journey, Sophie pulling the sled while Maya pushed from behind. The snow was falling so heavily now that their outbound footprints had already disappeared. They made it to the house, unloaded the wood onto the covered porch, and headed back out despite Rose's protests that they should wait for the storm to ease. Sophie knew better. The forecast suggested this would continue well into tomorrow. On their second trip, as they rounded the corner of the shed, Maya suddenly stopped. "Did you hear that?" she asked, voice muffled by her scarf. Sophie paused, listening. At first she heard nothing but the howling wind. Then, a faint metallic creaking, followed by what sounded like breaking glass. "It's coming from down there." Maya pointed toward the old service road that ran behind their property. It wasn't much more than a dirt track that loggers had used years ago to access the back acres. "Probably just a tree branch fallen on something," Sophie said, but she felt uneasy. That hadn't sounded like a tree branch. "We should check," Maya insisted. "What if someone's out there?" Sophie hesitated. The smart thing would be to get the firewood and go back inside. But if someone was out there in this weather— 5 minutes, she conceded. "But we stay together, understand?" They left the sled and followed the sound, the rope between them now a vital lifeline as visibility dropped to mere feet. The service road dipped down a small hill, and as they carefully made their way down the slope, the wind momentarily died down enough for them to see it, a large black shape half buried in the snow. "It's a car," Maya gasped. Not just any car, Sophie realized as they got closer. It was a massive luxury SUV, the kind no one in Pine Ridge could afford. It had clearly slid off the main road above, rolling down the embankment before coming to rest against a cluster of pine trees. One of the windows was shattered and snow was accumulating on the leather seats inside. "Hello?" Sophie called out, approaching cautiously. "Is anyone there? Do you need help?" No response came from inside the vehicle. The driver might have walked to find help, Sophie suggested, but even as she said it, she knew how unlikely that was. No one would abandon a vehicle like this unless they had no choice, and walking in this blizzard would be suicide for someone unfamiliar with the area. Maya had moved to the driver's side, standing on tiptoes to peer in through the window. Suddenly she screamed, "Sophie, there's someone inside!" Sophie rushed around, her heart pounding. Through the snow-dusted window she could make out a figure slumped across the front seats. A man in a dark coat, his head resting at an awkward angle against the passenger door. She tried the driver's door, locked. She knocked hard on the window, but the man didn't stir. "We need to get in there," Sophie decided, looking around frantically. She spotted a large rock half buried in snow and dragged it free. "Stand back, Maya." With one solid hit, she shattered the driver's side window, quickly reaching in to unlock the door. Cold air rushed into the vehicle as she pulled the door open, but the man didn't react. He was middle-aged with salt and pepper hair and an expensive-looking suit under his open coat. Blood had dried on his forehead from a gash near his hairline, and his breathing was shallow. Most concerning, his skin had a bluish tinge that Sophie recognized immediately as hypothermia. "He's alive, but barely," she told Maya, checking for a pulse at his neck. It was there, but weak and slow. "He must have been here for hours. What do we do?" Maya asked, her eyes wide with fear and concern. Sophie thought quickly. They were at least 4 miles from town, with impassable roads and no phone service on their cell phones. The stranger wouldn't survive much longer in these temperatures. "We have to get him to the house," she decided. "How? We can't carry him that far in the snow." Sophie's mind raced. "The sled. We can use it to transport him." Getting the unconscious man out of the SUV was a challenge. He was tall and solidly built, probably weighing twice what Sophie did. They managed to maneuver him out by working together, though they nearly dropped him twice. "Check his pockets," Sophie instructed as they laid him in the snow beside the vehicle. "See if he has a phone or ID." Maya searched his coat while Sophie examined the SUV for anything useful. She found a leather briefcase in the back seat and grabbed it, along with a heavy blanket from the trunk. "Found a wallet," Maya reported. "And a phone, but it's dead. We'll figure it out later." "Help me wrap him in this blanket." They positioned him on the sled as best they could, securing him with the rope from their waists. The man remained unconscious throughout, which was probably a blessing given the rough journey ahead. The trip back was grueling. The sled, designed for firewood, not grown men, kept wanting to tip over. The snow was falling so heavily now that Sophie could barely see Maya just a few feet ahead of her. They took turns pulling and stabilizing the sled, their progress agonizingly slow. By the time the cabin came into view, Sophie's legs were burning with exhaustion, and her fingers had gone numb despite her gloves. Maya was in no better shape, her face red from cold and exertion. Rose must have been watching for them because the back door flew open as they approached. "Dear God in heaven," she gasped when she saw their burden. "What have you found?" "Car crash victim," Sophie explained between labored breaths as they maneuvered the sled up the porch steps. "Down by the old service road. He's got hypothermia and probably a concussion." Rose moved with surprising speed for someone with arthritis, clearing space in front of the wood stove where a fire was already burning. "Bring him here, close to the heat, but not too close. Maya, get all the blankets from the linen closet." Together, they transferred the still unconscious man from the sled to the floor. In the light of the cabin, Sophie could see him more clearly. His clothes were expensive, the kind you'd see in big city stores, not the general outfitter in Pine Ridge. His face, though pale and drawn, had a commanding quality even in unconsciousness. "Who do you think he is?" Maya asked as she returned with an armful of blankets. Sophie shook her head. "No idea, not from around here, that's for sure. Some city person probably trying to get to one of those ski resorts up north. Took a wrong turn in the storm." Rose was already checking him over with the practiced movements of someone who'd raised 2 accident-prone children. "That cut needs cleaning, and we need to get him warmed up slowly." She glanced at the windows where snow continued to pile up. "No chance of getting him to a doctor anytime soon." "The roads are completely blocked and the phone lines went down while we were out," Sophie confirmed. "We're on our own." As they worked to make the stranger comfortable, Sophie couldn't help but wonder who he was and what he was doing on that back road. The nearest highway was 20 miles in the opposite direction. Rose seemed to read her thoughts. "Doesn't matter who he is right now. He's someone who needs help, and that's all we need to know." Sophie nodded, though something about the man nagged at her, a half-remembered glimpse of his face somewhere before. But that was impossible. People like him didn't come to towns like Pine Ridge, not anymore. Not since the mill closed. Outside, the storm continued to rage, trapping them all together in the small cabin, the 2 sisters, their grandmother, and the mysterious stranger whose life now rested in their hands. None of them could have guessed how this man's presence would soon turn their world upside down, or that the blizzard outside was nothing compared to the storm his identity would unleash. Morning came with no break in the storm. If anything, the wind howled more fiercely, rattling the cabin's windows and driving snow into drifts that now reached halfway up the front door. Sophie woke to the soft crackling of the wood stove and the unfamiliar sound of a man's labored breathing. For a moment, she was disoriented. Then yesterday's events rushed back. The treacherous trip through the blizzard, finding the crashed SUV, rescuing the stranger who now lay on their living room floor wrapped in every spare blanket they owned. She slipped quietly from beneath her covers, careful not to wake Maya, who slept soundly beside her. They'd shared a bed since the storm began, conserving heat and space now that their small cabin had an unexpected guest. In the dim light of early dawn, Sophie checked on her grandmother first. Rose was asleep in a rocking chair, having insisted on taking the first watch over their patient. A thin quilt covered her lap, and her chin rested on her chest, soft snores escaping with each breath. Sophie turned her attention to the stranger. His color looked better than yesterday. The alarming blue tinge had faded from his lips and fingertips. Rose had cleaned and bandaged the gash on his forehead, but the bruise surrounding it had darkened overnight to a deep purple. As she leaned closer to check his breathing, his eyes suddenly flew open. Sophie nearly toppled backward in surprise. The man's gaze darted around the room in panic before settling on her face. "Where?" His voice emerged as a dry croak. "You're safe," Sophie said quickly, keeping her voice low. "My sister and I found you in your car yesterday during the storm. You had an accident." He tried to sit up but winced immediately, falling back with a groan. "Careful," Sophie warned. You hit your head pretty hard. You might have a concussion. The man raised a hand to the bandage on his forehead, his movement slow and tentative. How long have I been here? Since yesterday afternoon. About 18 hours. He seemed to process this information, his brow furrowing in concentration. The road, it disappeared in the snow. I couldn't see. His voice trailed off as he tried to piece together the memory. You're lucky we found you when we did, Sophie said, pouring water from a pitcher into a cup. Another hour out there and you might not have made it. Can you sit up a little to drink? She helped him lift his head, supporting his shoulders as he took small sips. Up close, she noticed details she'd missed yesterday. The fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the perfectly manicured nails, the subtle scent of expensive cologne still lingering beneath the antiseptic Rose had used on his wound. Thank you, he said, laying back down. I don't even know your name. I'm Sophie. That's my grandmother, Rose, in the chair there. And my sister Maya is still sleeping. What's your name? He opened his mouth to answer, then paused, a flash of confusion crossing his face. Richard, he finally said. My name is Richard. Just Richard? Sophie asked. He pressed his fingers against his temples. My head? It's foggy. The last few days are a blur. Rose stirred then, awakened by their voices. Well, look who's rejoined the land of the living, she said, adjusting her position in the chair with a wince. Gave us quite a scare, young man. I'm sorry for the intrusion, Richard said, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I appreciate your help. Nonsense, Rose waved away his thanks. We couldn't very well leave you to freeze. Sophie, check if the phones are working yet. We should let the sheriff know we've got an injured traveler. Sophie checked the landline, unsurprised to find it still dead. She peered out the window at the continuing storm. Lines are probably down all over the county in this weather. And the cell towers never work right during storms. Where exactly am I? Richard asked, managing to push himself up to a sitting position. Pine Ridge, Rose answered. About 20 miles off Route 16 in the mountains. Richard frowned. I was supposed to be heading north to Lakeside. The GPS must have rerouted me when the main highway closed. Lakeside? Sophie repeated. The luxury resort town was a good 50 miles from Pine Ridge, a playground for the wealthy where vacation homes sat empty most of the year. What business did you have there? Before Richard could answer, Maya appeared in the doorway, her eyes widening at the sight of the now conscious stranger. He's awake, she exclaimed, moving closer with unabashed curiosity. Hi, I'm Maya. We found you in the snow. Richard's expression softened. So I've heard. Thank you for your bravery, Maya. Not many people would venture out in weather like that. Sophie did most of the work, Maya said with a shrug. I just helped. Well, I'm grateful to both of you, Richard C. Aid. He attempted to stand but swayed dangerously. Whoa there, Sophie steadied him. You're not going anywhere just yet. The roads are completely snowed in and you're still weak. She's right, Rose added. Sheriff won't even try to clear these back roads until the main streets in town are done. And that'll take days with this much snow. You're stuck with us for a while, Richard. By midday, Richard was able to stay awake for longer periods, though he still moved gingerly, clearly in pain. The power remained out, but the cabin was warm thanks to the wood stove. Sophie cooked a simple lunch of canned soup heated over the fire, while Maya entertained their guest with stories and questions. So what do you do, Richard? Maya asked as they sat around the kitchen table. I bet you do something important. You look important. Sophie shot her sister a warning look, but Richard just chuckled. I work in resource management, he said vaguely. Nothing very exciting. Is that why you drive such a fancy car? Maya persisted. Sophie says it probably cost more than our house. Maya. Sophie scolded. It's all right, Richard assured her. I suppose the car is rather flashy for these parts. For any parts, Rose muttered under her breath. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Sophie hurried to change the subject. Your things are by the door, she said. Your phone was dead when we found you, but we saved your briefcase and wallet. Maybe there's someone you'd like to call when the phones are working again? Family who might be worried? A shadow crossed Richard's face. No family, he said quietly. Just colleagues who aren't expecting me until later this week. As the day wore on, Richard seemed increasingly fascinated by the family's simple lifestyle. He watched Sophie carefully bank the fire to conserve wood, observed Rose's methodical organization of their limited supplies, and joined Maya in a game of cards played by candlelight as the early winter. Darkness set in, You all work together so well, he commented as Sophie and Maya washed the dinner dishes using water they'd heated on the stove. We've had practice, Sophie replied. When the power goes out this often, you learn to adapt. Has it always been just the three of you? Richard asked. The question hung heavy in the air. Sophie exchanged glances with Rose, who nodded slightly. No, Sophie said, her voice controlled. Our parents died 3 years ago. Dad first, then Mom the following winter. I'm sorry, Richard said, and he seemed genuinely affected by the information. That must have been incredibly difficult. It was, Maya said simply, her usual chatter subdued. Dad lost his job when the mill closed. He tried to find work, but there wasn't anything around here, and we couldn't afford to move. He got really quiet and sad. Then his heart just stopped one day. Richard's face paled. The mill? Northern Resources Lumber, Rose explained, her voice hardening. Biggest employer in Pine Ridge for over 50 years. Some corporation bought it, ran it for a few years, then shut it down without warning. 300 families lost their income overnight. Richard swallowed visibly. I hadn't realized. Why would you? Rose asked. Small towns like ours disappear every day and no one in the big cities notices. Sophie moved to the bookshelf, pulling down a photo album. She wasn't sure why she wanted to show these pictures to a stranger, but something in his reaction made her continue. She opened to a page showing a much younger Rose standing beside a tall man in front of the lumber mill. That's my grandfather on the day he became foreman, she explained, and this one is my dad when he started working there at 18. She flipped through more photos, community picnics hosted by the mill, her father receiving a 20-year service award, family Christmas parties with decorations made from mill scraps. Richard studied each photo intently, his fingers hovering over the images without quite touching them. Your family's entire history is connected to that place, he murmured. Not just our family, Sophie said. The whole town. When the mill closed, everything changed. Half the shops on Main Street are boarded up now. The hospital cut back to a clinic. People who'd lived here their whole lives had to leave. Richard looked physically pained, his eyes fixed on a photo of Sophie's father standing proudly by a stack of freshly cut timber. What was his name? Richard asked, his voice strangely hoarse. Thomas, Rose answered. Thomas Preston. The kindest man you'd ever meet and the hardest worker, too. Richard closed his eyes briefly, as if committing the name to memory. When he opened them again, Sophie thought she saw a shimmer of moisture, but he quickly looked away. The evening progressed with stories shared around the wood stove. Despite his initial reticence, Richard proved to be a good listener, asking questions about their lives and seeming genuinely interested in their answers. For brief moments, Sophie almost forgot he was a wealthy stranger from another world. As they prepared for bed, arranging blankets and pillows to accommodate their guest for another night, Richard approached Sophie by the window where she stood watching the still falling snow. I can't thank you enough, he said quietly, not just for saving my life, but for... He gestured vaguely around the cabin. For this. For showing me... Showing you what? Sophie asked when he didn't continue. Richard looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, part admiration, part something that looked almost like guilt. How people live, he finally said. Real people, not just numbers on a spreadsheet. Before Sophie could ask what he meant, Maya called her to help with the sleeping arrangements, and the moment passed. But as she drifted off to sleep that night, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that their mysterious guest was hiding something connected to the pain her family had endured these past 3 years. Outside, the storm finally began to ease, the wind dropping to a whisper as the clouds thinned. By morning, the roads would begin to clear, phone lines would be repaired, and the truth about Richard's identity would come crashing down on the Preston family like an avalanche none of them could escape. Sophie woke to a different world. Sunlight streamed through the frost-covered windows, painfully bright after days of gray skies. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a blinding white landscape and a silence so complete it felt almost unnatural after the howling winds. She slipped from bed, careful not to disturb Maya, and moved to the window. The snow had to be at least 4 feet deep, with drifts much higher in places. The road was invisible, buried completely under the pristine white blanket. But the sky was clear blue, promising a break in their isolation if the county plows could make it out to these back roads. Beautiful, isn't it? She turned to find Richard standing in the doorway. looking stronger than he had the day before. The color had returned to his face, though the bruise on his forehead had spread, painting one side of his face in shades of purple and yellow. "It is," she agreed. "Dangerous but beautiful." He moved to stand beside her at the window, and they watched a cardinal land on a snow-covered branch, a shocking splash of red against the white. "I tried the phone," Richard said. "Still dead. The lines probably came down in the storm. Could be days before they're fixed out here. We're not exactly a priority." Richard nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "I need to check on my car today. See if it can be dug out or at least retrieve anything important." "It's buried under 4 feet of snow at the bottom of a gully," Sophie reminded him. "And you're still recovering." "Nevertheless," he insisted, "I should at least try. I've imposed on your family's generosity long enough." Sophie studied him, noting the restlessness in his stance. After 3 days confined to their small cabin, she understood his need to do something, anything. She felt it too. "We'll go after breakfast," she decided, "but we'll need to be careful. The snow will be treacherous." By mid-morning, the entire household was awake. Rose had managed to coax a fire to life in the wood stove, and the smell of oatmeal cooking filled the cabin. Maya chatted animatedly about her plans to build the biggest snowman Pine Ridge had ever seen. "You'll help, right, Richard?" she asked between spoonfuls of oatmeal. Richard smiled, the expression softening his otherwise serious face. "I suppose I owe you that much, at least." After breakfast, Sophie found her father's old snowshoes in the shed and showed Richard how to strap them on. "These should keep you from sinking too deep in the drifts." "You're quite resourceful," he commented as he awkwardly tested his weight on the unfamiliar equipment. "Necessity," Sophie replied with a shrug. "Around here, you learn to make do." The journey to the crash site took twice as long as it had during the storm. The bright sun was deceptive. The temperature remained well below freezing, and their breath crystallized in the air with each exhale. Sophie led the way, creating a path that Richard could follow in his borrowed snowshoes. The SUV was exactly where they'd left it, though now it was little more than a black shape beneath a white mound. Only part of one window remained visible. "I didn't realize it was this bad," Richard murmured, staring at his buried vehicle. "What did you expect after 3 days in a blizzard?" Sophie began clearing snow from the driver's side door, her gloved hand scooping away the powder. "We'll need to dig out the door at least." "What is it you need to get?" Richard joined her in digging. "My laptop, some papers, contact information for my office." It took nearly an hour of exhausting work before they cleared enough snow to wrench open the driver's door. The interior was frigid, with snow having drifted in through the window they'd broken during the rescue. Richard leaned in and retrieved his laptop bag from the back seat, along with a leather portfolio. He checked the contents with what looked like relief, then reached under the passenger seat and pulled out a small metal case. "All set?" Sophie asked, stamping her feet to keep warm. Richard nodded, but his gaze lingered on the vehicle. "It's not going anywhere soon. I'll need to call a tow service once the roads are cleared." They turned to head back to the cabin when a distinctive sound broke the winter silence. The rumble of a snowplow in the distance. "They're clearing Elm Road," Sophie said, recognizing the route. "That means the main roads must already be open." Richard's expression brightened. "That's good news. Perhaps I can arrange for transportation back to the city sooner than expected." Sophie felt a strange twinge of disappointment at his eagerness to leave, though she couldn't explain why. This man was a stranger after all, one who clearly didn't belong in their world of makeshift solutions and careful rationing. When they returned to the cabin, they found Rose on the porch talking to their neighbor, Mr. Daniels, who had made his way over on his ancient snowmobile. "Power's still out all over town," he was saying as they approached, "but they got the phone lines working again about an hour ago. Sheriff says the highway should be passable by tomorrow." Richard straightened, suddenly businesslike. "May I use your phone? I need to make some calls." "Of course," Rose said, leading the way inside. "It's just a landline, nothing fancy." While Richard made his calls from the kitchen, speaking too quietly for her to hear, Sophie helped Maya start on her snowman. But her mind kept drifting to their guest, to the polished way he spoke, to his expensive clothes and car. "Who do you think he really is?" Maya asked, as if reading her thoughts while they rolled a massive ball of snow for the base. Sophie shrugged. "Some businessman, I guess. He said he works in resource management, whatever that means." "I like him," Maya declared. He listens when I talk, not like most grown-ups. Sophie smiled at her sister's simple assessment. It was true. Richard had shown genuine interest in their stories, had treated Maya with respect, rather than the condescending tone many adults used with children. When they returned to the cabin for lunch, Richard was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open. The sight was jarring. This modern piece of technology seemed out of place in their rustic home, especially with the power still out. "Battery still works," he explained when he caught Sophie staring. "I need to review some files before my colleagues come to pick me up tomorrow." "You've arranged a ride?" Rose asked, setting a pot of soup on the wood stove to heat. Richard nodded. "A company car will meet me at the main road once it's cleared. I've imposed on you all long enough." "You're not an imposition," Maya protested. "You can stay longer if you want. I was going to teach you how to make snow angels tomorrow." Richard smiled, but Sophie noticed it didn't reach his eyes. "That's very kind, Maya, but I have responsibilities I need to attend to." After lunch, Sophie decided to charge her own laptop using the small generator they reserved for emergencies. It had been days since she'd checked her email, and with final exams coming up after the holiday break, she needed to see if her teachers had sent any assignments. Richard offered to help her set up the generator, and together they got it running in the shed. The familiar hum of electricity felt like a luxury after days without power. "Your laptop is quite old," Richard observed as she connected the charger. "It does the job," Sophie replied defensively. It was a second-hand model she'd purchased with 6 months of saved waitressing tips. "I didn't mean to offend," he said quickly. "I'm just surprised you manage your schoolwork on such limited technology." "We manage a lot of things with limited resources," she said, more sharply than she'd intended. Back in the cabin, Sophie sat up at the kitchen table while Richard moved to the living room with Maya for a promised game of checkers. While waiting for her ancient laptop to boot up, Sophie picked up Richard's leather portfolio that he'd left on the table. She hadn't meant to snoop, but as she moved it aside, a business card slipped out. She picked it up, intending to return it to the portfolio, when the company logo caught her eye. A stylized tree with Northern Resources Corporation printed beneath it. Her breath caught in her throat. Hands trembling, she turned the card over to read, "Richard Harrington, Chief Executive Officer, Northern Resources Corporation." The room seemed to tilt around her. Richard Harrington, the name that had been cursed in their house for 3 years. The man whose signature had been on the mill closure notice. The man whose decision had set in motion the chain of events that destroyed her family. Almost in a trance, Sophie opened her laptop. Once connected to their spotty rural internet, she typed his name into the search engine. Dozens of results appeared instantly, along with a professional photograph that confirmed what she already knew. Their houseguest, the man whose life they had saved, was the CEO of the company that had ruined their lives. Her fingers clicked through news articles and company press releases. Northern Resources announces closure of Pine Ridge facility. CEO cites market pressures. Harrington defends job cuts as necessary restructuring. Northern CEO receives bonus after successful cost-cutting measures. Each headline felt like a physical blow. In one photo, Richard stood smiling at a charity gala, champagne glass in hand, dated just 2 months after her father's funeral. "Sophie, are you okay?" Richard's voice broke through her shock. She looked up to find him standing in the doorway, concern etched on his face. For a moment she couldn't speak, could only stare at this stranger who suddenly wasn't a stranger at all. "You're him," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned the laptop so he could see his own face on the screen. "Richard Harrington, CEO of Northern Resources." All color drained from his face. His eyes moved from the screen to the business card still clutched in her hand. "Sophie, I can explain." "Explain what?" Her voice rose as the shock gave way to anger. "Explain how you shut down the mill without warning? Explain how you gave no severance to workers who'd been there for decades. Or maybe explain how my dad died of a heart attack 3 months later because he couldn't find work and couldn't support his family." Richard took a step back, his face stricken. "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know." Sophie was on her feet now, years of grief and anger finding their target at last. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know. People like you never do. We're just numbers on a spreadsheet to you." The commotion brought Rose and Maya from the other room. Maya looked confused, but Rose's expression changed the instant she saw the laptop screen. "It's him," Sophie told her grandmother, pointing at Richard, the CEO of Northern Resources. "The man who closed the mill." Rose went very still, her eyes fixed on Richard with a hardness Sophie had never seen before. "Is this true?" she asked quietly. Richard seemed to shrink under her gaze. "Yes," he admitted. "I am Richard Harrington. I'm the CEO of Northern Resources Corporation. The man who destroyed this town," Rose said, her voice like ice. "The man whose decision killed my son." In the awful silence that followed, Maya was the only one who moved, stepping closer to Richard with confusion in her eyes. "But you're nice," she said simply. "How could you do something so mean?" And somehow that childish question, free from the adult complexities of anger and blame, seemed to cut Richard more deeply than all of Sophie's accusations. He sank into a chair, his face in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were filled with a pain that matched their own. "I never saw the faces," he said hoarsely. "Never understood the lives behind the numbers. Please let me explain." But Sophie wasn't ready to hear explanations. 3 years of struggle and grief couldn't be wiped away with words. She grabbed her coat from the hook by the door. "I need some air," she said, and walked out into the blinding white world, leaving behind the man whose life she had saved, never imagining he was the one who had destroyed hers. Sophie trudged through the snow until her legs ached and her lungs burned with each frigid breath. She had no destination in mind, only the need to put distance between herself and the cabin, between herself and Richard Harrington. She found herself at the old oak tree where her father had hung a tire swing when she was Maya's age. The swing was long gone, the rope having rotted away years ago, but the massive tree remained, its bare branches stretching toward the clear winter sky like gnarled fingers. Sophie brushed snow from a fallen log and sat, her anger gradually giving way to a deep, hollow exhaustion. 3 years of struggling to hold her family together, of working multiple jobs while trying to finish school, of watching her sister grow up without parents, all because of decisions made by the man now sitting in their kitchen. The irony wasn't lost on her. They had saved his life, brought him into their home, shared their limited food and firewood, all without knowing who he really was. If they had left him in that car, no. Sophie pushed the thought away. Despite everything, she couldn't regret saving a human life. Her parents had taught her better than that. The sound of crunching snow announced someone's approach. Sophie expected Maya or even Rose, but when she looked up, it was Richard who stood there, uncertainty written across his face. "Your grandmother said I might find you here," he said, keeping a respectful distance. "She also said I should leave you alone, but He hesitated. "I couldn't let you go without trying to explain." "There's nothing to explain," Sophie said flatly. "You closed the mill. People lost jobs. Lives fell apart. Business is business, right?" Richard winced at her words. "That's what I told myself," he admitted, his breath fogging in the cold air. "That's the story executives like me repeat until we believe it. But these past few days," he gestured at the snow-covered landscape, "being here with your family, seeing firsthand what our decision did to this town, to your family specifically, I can't hide behind those excuses anymore." Sophie said nothing, but she didn't leave either. After a moment, Richard carefully sat on the log beside her, leaving space between them. "When I made the decision to close this mill, I was looking at spreadsheets and profit margins," he said quietly. Pine Ridge was just a name on a document, one of dozens of small operations we'd acquired. The mill was operating at a loss, and from a purely financial perspective, closing it made sense. "My dad worked at that mill for 23 years, Sophie said. "Did you know that?" "Did your spreadsheets tell you that?" Richard shook his head. "No, the spreadsheets didn't show me Thomas Preston's face. They didn't tell me he had a wife and 2 daughters who depended on him. They didn't show me what would happen when 300 families suddenly lost their income in a town with no other opportunities." He looked down at his hands. "I made that decision from a corner office 1,000 miles away. I never saw the human cost until now," Sophie said. "Until now," he agreed. "Until I found myself at the mercy of the very people my decisions had hurt most. The irony isn't lost on me, Sophie." A bird called somewhere in the distance, the sound sharp in the winter stillness. Sophie pulled her coat tighter against the cold. "What happens now?" she asked. "You go back to your life and we go back to ours?" You've had your enlightenment moment and everything's supposed to be better. No, Richard said firmly. Nothing can undo what's been done. But I can try to make amends. Real, concrete amends. Sophie gave a bitter laugh. How? You can't bring my parents back? No, I can't, he acknowledged. And I would never pretend that anything I do could make up for that loss. But I can help this town. I can help your family. Before Sophie could respond, Maya's voice called out, Sophie! Richard, Grandma says to come back. The power's on! They turned to see Maya running toward them, her blue hat bobbing through the snow. She slowed as she approached, looking uncertainly between them. Are you still fighting? She asked. Richard stood. We're talking, Maya. Sometimes adults need to have difficult conversations. Maya nodded as if she understood completely. Grandma's making hot chocolate. The real kind, not the instant stuff. She looked at Richard. She said you can have some too if Sophie says it's okay. Sophie felt a rush of love for her grandmother, who was extending an olive branch in the way she knew best, through food. Rose wasn't ready to forgive, none of them were, but she was willing to listen. It's okay, Sophie said, rising from the log. We could all use some hot chocolate. Back at the cabin, the lights were on and the electric heater hummed, a welcome compliment to the wood stove's warmth. Rose sat at the kitchen table, her expression guarded as they entered. Maya, help me with these mugs, she said, giving the adults space to continue their conversation. Richard sat across from Rose, his posture straight but his eyes humble. Mrs. Preston, I can never adequately express how sorry I am for the role my decisions played in your family's tragedy. Rose studied him, her weathered hands wrapped around her mug. Sorry doesn't pay bills or raise children, she said bluntly. Sorry doesn't bring back my son and daughter-in-law. You're right, Richard agreed. Which is why I'm not just offering apologies. I want to make things right as much as possible. How? Sophie asked, taking a seat beside her grandmother. Richard reached for his laptop. I've been making calls and reviewing files since the power came back on, he explained. The decision to close the mill was mine, but reopening it can also be mine. Sophie exchanged a skeptical look with her grandmother. Just like that? After 3 years? Not just like that, Richard admitted. It will take time and investment. But Northern Resources still owns the property and equipment. Most of it can be restored. He opened a spreadsheet on his computer. I've run the preliminary numbers. With some modernization and a new approach to operations, the mill could be viable again. And this sudden change of heart is because, Rose asked. Richard met her gaze directly. Because I was wrong. Because I've seen firsthand the human cost of that decision, and because I believe that businesses have responsibilities beyond profit margins. That's not how corporations usually work, Sophie pointed out. No, Richard agreed, but I'm in a position to change that, at least within my company. I own a controlling interest in Northern Resources. What I'm proposing isn't charity, it's better business. Sustainable operations that support communities rather than abandoning them. Maya, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. Does this mean people will get their jobs back? Richard smiled at her. Yes, Maya, that's exactly what it means. The conversation lasted well into the evening, with Richard outlining his plans not just for reopening the mill, but for establishing a community development fund and creating scholarship programs for local students, including Sophie. I don't want your guilt money, Sophie said when he mentioned the scholarship. It's not guilt money, Richard replied. It's an investment in potential. You wanted to study engineering before all this happened, didn't you? I saw those brochures in your room. Sophie was surprised he had noticed. That was a different life. It doesn't have to be. By morning, the main roads were clear enough for Richard's company car to reach them. As he packed his few belongings, there was an awkward moment at the door. I know you have no reason to trust me, he said. Words are easy, but I promise you'll hear from me within the week with concrete plans. Rose nodded stiffly. We'll see. Maya was less reserved, giving him a quick hug. Don't forget about us when you go back to being important, she said. I couldn't if I tried, Richard assured her. Sophie walked him to the car, where a driver waited with the engine running. Why should we believe anything will change? She asked. How do we know this isn't just you feeling temporarily guilty? Richard considered her question seriously. You don't know, he finally said. But I hope you'll judge me by my actions in the coming months, not just my words today. 6 months later, on a warm spring day, Sophie stood at the edge of the newly renovated mill property, watching as workers installed the sign above the entrance, Preston Lumber Cooperative. The mill had reopened 2 months earlier under a new model, employee-owned, with profit sharing and sustainable forestry practices. Already nearly 100 people had returned to work, with more positions opening as operations expanded. Richard had kept his word, not with empty gestures but with substantial investment and a complete restructuring of how Northern Resources operated in small communities. The scholarship fund he'd established had already accepted its first class of recipients, including Sophie, who would start engineering classes in the fall. She felt a presence beside her and turned to find Richard, dressed more casually than she'd ever seen him, in jeans and a button-down shirt. "What do you think?" he asked, nodding toward the sign. "Dad would have been proud to see his name there," Sophie admitted. "It was the least I could do," Richard said. "This mill will stand as a reminder of what happens when business forgets its human responsibilities, and how it's never too late to correct course." Sophie studied the man beside her. She didn't know if she could ever fully forgive him for the role he played in her parents' deaths, but she had come to respect his determination to make amends. "Maya's waiting at the diner," she said. "She made me promise to bring you by before you head back to the city. Something about teaching you to play that card game properly this time." Richard smiled. "I'd like that." As they walked toward town, Sophie noticed new signs of life everywhere. The general store expanding its inventory, a new cafe opening where the old pharmacy had been, young families moving into homes that had stood empty for years. One man's decision had nearly killed Pine Ridge. Now, one man's change of heart was helping to bring it back to life. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Her parents were still gone, and the town would never be exactly what it was before. But as Sophie looked around at the community rebuilding itself, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 long years. Hope. Some might call it justice, others redemption. Sophie wasn't sure what to call it. But as spring brought new growth to the mountains around Pine Ridge, she knew that saving Richard Harrington's life that snowy day had somehow, against all odds, helped save their own.